Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The planet Varathzone had been standing for 63 years, which in the context of colonial architecture meant it had been standing for approximately 63 years longer than some of its foundational engineers had privately believed it would. Joel Reyes knew this because he had read the pre-collapse structural assessment on the transport down, and the pre-collapse structural assessment was the kind of document that explained, in the careful passive voice of someone who wanted to register concern without registering blame, that certain resonance tolerances had been interpreted with what it called creative flexibility during the original construction phase. Joel had read this, looked out the transport window at the approaching colony, and thought, with the particular resignation of a man in his profession, that creative flexibility was doing a remarkable amount of heavy lifting in that sentence, which was ironic given the circumstances. He was on the ground by the time the second aftershock came through, a deep, low-frequency shudder that moved through the soles of his boots and up into his teeth in a way that his body had learned over 11 years to read as structural rather than seismic. The difference mattered. Seismic meant the ground was still deciding what it wanted to do. Structural meant the buildings had already decided, and the decision was irreversible, and the only question remaining was the shape of the aftermath. The central residential district of Varathzone had made its decision approximately 6 hours before Joel arrived, and the shape of the aftermath was the particular accordion fold of cascading column failure. Tier after tier of prefabricated habitat compressing downward in sequence, leaving behind a debris field that covered 8 city blocks and contained, according to the casualty projection running on his tablet, somewhere between 400 and 900 people in various states of needing to be found. His team moved in standard formation, 4 extraction specialists, 2 structural engineers whose entire job was to prevent the rescue from becoming an additional casualty event, and 1 logistics coordinator named Bryn who handled the equipment manifest and had the organizational instincts of someone who had once, famously, requisitioned a fully functional emergency generator during a blackout on Cassis Station, by convincing 3 separate supply officers that each of the others had already approved it. Joel valued Bryn enormously, and had once told her so directly, which had surprised her enough that she had momentarily lost track of a crate of thermal cutting equipment, which was the only time Joel had ever seen her lose track of anything. The acoustic sensors went in first. The debris field on Varathzone had the particular acoustic signature of composite polymer over stress-fractured rebar, a dense matrix that swallowed lower frequencies and conducted higher ones in unpredictable directions, which meant that survivor signals, when they came, arrived at the sensors in fragments, partial transmissions that the processing unit reassembled into location estimates, with a confidence interval that Joel's team had learned to treat as a suggestion rather than a fact. The confidence interval on the first signal of the afternoon was 63%, which his structural engineer Dow greeted with the mild optimism of a person who had spent enough time in debris fields to consider 63% an encouraging number. Joel did not share this optimism, but he shared its direction, which was toward Section 3 of the collapsed district, where the accordion fold had left a series of irregular cavities that the thermal imaging was reading as potentially occupied. Section 3 required 40 minutes of careful lateral excavation before it gave anything up. Joel worked in the particular focused silence his team had developed together over 4 deployments, not the silence of people who had nothing to say, but the silence of people who had learned that the debris field required their full attention, and that full attention was incompatible with commentary. Bryn, who was not in the debris field and was therefore not bound by this convention, provided intermittent updates through the earpiece with the calm informational tone she used for everything, whether she was reporting a survivor signal or informing him that the catering unit had run out of something called a nutrient composite, which was apparently what the logistics manifest was calling, what the team privately referred to as the cracker situation. The signal came through at the 14th hour, high frequency, irregular, the specific acoustic pattern that the processing unit flagged as biological respiration rather than structural settling. Joel stopped moving. The rest of the team stopped moving. The debris field for approximately 3 seconds held its breath along with everyone in it. Then the unit gave him a location, a depth, and a confidence interval of 89%, which Dow, in a voice carefully stripped of anything resembling emotion, described as quite good, actually. Joel was already moving toward it. 3 days in a disaster zone had a way of compressing a person down to their most functional components. The parts that moved, assessed, extracted, documented, and then moved again, while quietly setting aside the parts that processed, reflected, or entertained philosophical questions about the nature of what they were doing and why. Joel had made his peace with this compression early in his career. It was not dissociation, which was a clinical term for something that happened without consent. It was more like triage applied to the self, a deliberate suspension of the non-essential until the essential work was done, at which point the non-essential could be retrieved, dusted off, and reattached to the personality in whatever order seemed most appropriate. What he had not made peace with, and never entirely would, was the mathematics of the casualty list. The confirmed survivors held at 211. The confirmed dead climbed in increments that got smaller each day, which was not comfort but was a different kind of information. The missing column shrank in both directions simultaneously, and Joel had learned long ago not to track which direction any individual name moved, because that way lay the kind of grief that spent oxygen faster than the air pockets replenished it, and he still had people to find. He was in Section 7 when the priority channel opened for the 3rd time. The first 2 times, he had looked at the authorization code, registered that it existed, and returned his attention to the acoustic sensor output, which was showing something in the lower registers that might have been a survivor or might have been a water pipe developing opinions about the structural situation around it. The 3rd time, the tablet added a small secondary notification informing him, in text so apologetically formatted it practically had a hat in its hand, that continued non-acknowledgement within 60 seconds would initiate an automatic diplomatic incident under Article 14 of the Outer Crescent Communication Protocols. Joel stared at this for a moment with the expression of a man who had been awake for the better part of 70 hours and had just been informed that the universe intended to add paperwork to his existing list of concerns. He acknowledged the channel. The voice on the other end belonged to someone who introduced himself as Director Sarath of the Royal Velhari Security Directorate, and who delivered information the way certain structural engineers delivered load assessments, with complete precision and no apparent awareness that the person receiving the information might need a moment to adjust to it. He explained that cross-referencing the extraction records with the triage intake logs had produced a confirmed match. He explained what the match meant. He explained that Her Sovereign Majesty Queen Elindra IV had expressed a personal desire to meet the individual responsible for the relevant extraction. He explained that a transport had been dispatched. He explained that the relief camp coordinator had been informed. He explained that Joel's presence was expected at the designated location in 2 hours, and that this expectation carried the formal weight of a sovereign request under 3 active intergovernmental treaties, which meant it was technically optional in the same way that gravity was technically optional if one was prepared to accept the alternative conditions. Joel said that he was currently in the middle of a debris field. Director Sarath said that he was aware of this. Joel said that the acoustic signal in Section 7 had not been resolved. Director Sarath said that he had been briefed on the Section 7 signal and that another member of Joel's team could continue the assessment. Joel looked at the sensor output for a long moment. Then he handed the unit to Dow, who took it with the expression of someone who had heard enough of the conversation through the earpiece to have formed an opinion about it, but was professionally committed to not sharing that opinion in the field. Joel climbed out of Section 7 and brushed approximately a third of Verathzone from his jacket, which was the most optimistic interpretation of the gesture, since the jacket itself appeared to have permanently incorporated the remaining two-thirds into its structural composition. The escort waiting at the perimeter had the practiced stillness of people trained to wait for things without letting the waiting show on their faces. Joel looked at them. They looked at him. One of them, very briefly, looked at the jacket, and then returned his gaze to the middle distance with the discipline of someone who had survived royal service by developing the ability to not react to things in real time. The converted relief tent that someone had arranged into a formal meeting space in the intervening period was making a genuine effort. The folding chairs had been positioned with the angular intention of suggesting sovereign authority, and the portable lighting units had been redistributed to illuminate the front of the room in a way that was clearly supposed to convey something ceremonial. Joel stood in the entrance and took this in. Then he took in the Queen, who was already present, and who had the quality of someone who had not slept in 3 days and had decided that this was information she would be sharing with no one. She crossed the room before he had completed the thought, moving through the careful geometry of the folding chairs with the absolute disregard of someone who had not arranged them and saw no obligation to acknowledge them. She stopped at a distance that was closer than protocol and farther than personal, and she looked at him with eyes that were doing several things simultaneously, and she said, through the translation unit at his collar, "You didn't know who she was." Joel said no. He said it simply, because it was simply true. The Queen looked at him for a long moment that had considerable weight in it, and then asked, in the tone of someone whose daughter had been very specific on this point, whether he was the one who had talked about the beam with 3 support points. Joel said that he was. She said her daughter had described this as the funniest thing she had ever heard, and that she herself was withholding judgment pending further information about the beam. The beam, Joel explained, had 3 support points because the original construction spec had called for 2, and someone on the Verathzone building team had apparently decided that the third was a reasonable personal contribution to the structural philosophy of the project. This was, in the context of the broader construction history of the colony, the single best decision anyone had made in 63 years, because 2 support points under those load conditions would have given the cavity a survivable window of approximately 4 hours before the pressure differential collapsed it, and her daughter had been in the cavity for somewhere closer to 9. The third support point was, by Joel's structural engineer's estimate, the reason the princess was available to have opinions about beams at all. The Queen listened to this with the focused attention of someone filing information in a place they intended to return to. Then she said that her daughter had not mentioned the structural significance. She had mentioned that the human had explained it while crawling through rubble in the dark in a voice that sounded, according to the princess, like someone describing a very pleasant afternoon. Joel said that this was a professional methodology. The Queen said that her daughter had called it the opposite of scary. There was a pause in which Joel processed the fact that this was possibly the most precise description of his field communication technique that anyone had ever produced, including the IERD's official training manual, which used considerably more words and arrived at a less accurate result. He considered saying this, and decided that the Queen had not slept in 3 days and was maintaining her composure through what was visibly an act of sovereign will, and that the moment did not require his opinion of the training manual. Instead, he said that the princess had been very calm once they were moving, that she had stopped shaking somewhere around the second beam, which the structural team had spent 11 minutes stabilizing before he went in, and which was stable enough that he had felt comfortable telling her so, and which she had apparently chosen to believe despite having no particular reason to trust the word of a strange human she had just met in the dark under a collapsed building. He said that this suggested a fairly significant amount of personal courage for someone her age and size. The Queen said, very precisely, that her daughter was 9 years old and had been raised to understand that the Velhari sovereignty was a system spanning 4 inhabited worlds and 11 active colony installations, and that its continuity depended on the personal composure of its leadership under conditions of adversity. Joel said that this sounded like a considerable amount of pressure to place on a 9-year-old. The Queen looked at him. He had the distinct impression that no one had said this to her before, or at least not in this particular room with this particular degree of straightforwardness, and that she was not certain how to categorize the experience. The double iris of her eyes contracted slightly, which his 11 years of field experience had not prepared him to interpret, and which he therefore catalogued under further information pending and moved on. She said, after a moment, that her daughter had also told her the human had mentioned food. Joel said that he had mentioned the relief camp catering, yes, as a point of reference for what awaited her at the extraction perimeter. The Queen asked what specifically he had said about it. Joel said that he had described it as technically edible if approached with the right philosophical framework, and that he stood by this assessment, and that the catering team was doing their best under difficult conditions, and that the nutrient composite in particular had a great deal of structural integrity for something that was theoretically a food item. Something happened in the Queen's face that was brief and unannounced, and occupied the precise emotional space that a smile occupied in a human face without being configured like one. A release, a softening, a momentary departure from the composure, there and then gone, leaving the composure back in place like a door that had opened to show a lit room and then closed again. It was gone in under 2 seconds. Joel noted it with the same automatic precision he applied to acoustic signals, registered, stored, significance to be assessed later. She told him that the princess had eaten 3 servings of the nutrient composite and asked the medical staff whether she could have a 4th, and that the medical staff had said yes, because the princess had looked at them in a way that the senior medic had described in her report as diplomatically compelling. The Queen said this with the tone of a person who was not surprised and had possibly encountered this look before in non-medical contexts. Joel said that this tracked with his assessment of the princess's grip strength, which had also been diplomatically compelling. This time, the thing that happened in the Queen's face lasted almost 4 seconds before the composure reassembled itself, which Joel suspected was a significant duration by whatever standard applied, and which he carefully did not remark upon. She asked him, in the register of someone transitioning to a different kind of conversation, whether he drank coffee. She said that her daughter had been thorough in her research on human customs since the extraction and had concluded that coffee was important, and that offering it was the correct diplomatic gesture for this meeting. Joel said that her daughter had excellent instincts and that, yes, he drank coffee, and that this was the most accurately targeted diplomatic gesture anyone had aimed at him in 11 years of field work across 14 different colony systems. The Queen said that she would pass this along, and that her daughter would be insufferable about it for at least a week. Joel said that, in his professional opinion, she had earned it. The formal offer arrived on a Tuesday, which Joel noted was the same day of the week as the collapse, and which he decided meant nothing because he was not the kind of person who assigned meaning to coincidences involving days of the week, and also because on the colony worlds of the Outer Crescent, the local calendars ran on cycles that didn't map cleanly onto the standard 7-day format anyway. So Tuesday was already doing conceptual work it wasn't strictly qualified for. Specialist Commander Petra Voss delivered it across a folding table in the operations tent, with the directness he had always valued in her, which was the directness of someone who had spent 20 years turning catastrophe into manageable logistics, and had concluded that the most efficient path between 2 points was a sentence that said the thing it meant. She told him what the Velhari sovereignty had formally requested. She told him what the request meant under the relevant treaty frameworks. She told him that the position of Senior Disaster Relief Coordinator for the Sovereignty's Emergency Response Program had been created specifically and entirely because of him, which was either a significant honor or an indication that the Sovereignty's existing emergency response infrastructure was in a condition that required the invention of new job titles to address, and that in her assessment it was probably both. Joel asked about the infrastructure. Petra said it was approximately 12 years behind where it needed to be for a system of that population density and geographic complexity, and that this was a conservative estimate made by someone who was being generous about the word approximately. Joel looked at the offer document on the tablet. The document was in both standard interstellar administrative script and Velhari formal notation, and the Velhari formal notation section was considerably longer, which he suspected meant it was doing more work, the kind of work that translated not just the words but the weight of them, the cultural freight that made this not merely a job offer but a thing with legal and sovereign significance that the relevant treaties could see and had opinions about. He asked about the equipment budget. Petra made a note on her own tablet. She said the initial allocation was substantial, that the sovereignty had been specific about this, and that the specificity had the quality of someone who had been briefed on the kind of answer a disaster relief specialist was likely to give to a formal job offer and had prepared accordingly. Joel considered this for a moment and thought that whoever had prepared the briefing had good instincts. He thought also about the resonance fault beneath Verath's zone that had expressed its opinion about creative flexibility in foundational engineering across 8 city blocks and 419 confirmed casualties, and about the 11 other colony installations in the sovereignty that had been built during the same period by the same general philosophy, and about the acoustic signal in Section 7 that had turned out to be a water pipe and not a person, and about the particular arithmetic of what it meant to have 12 years of infrastructure deficit across 4 inhabited worlds. He said yes. He said it the way he noted acoustic signals without ceremony, because the significance was in the thing itself and not in how you announced it. Petra said good, and that the transport to the sovereignty's capital world left in 4 days, and that she expected him to actually be on it and not discover a debris field that urgently required his personal attention at the departure terminal. Joel said that this was an unfair characterization of his departure history. Petra read aloud from a tablet that appeared to contain documentation of his departure history. Joel revised his position to say that this was an accurate but uncharitable characterization of his departure history. He met the princess 2 days before he left, in a reception room in the temporary diplomatic facility that the sovereignty's advance team had established in the colony's administrative district, one of the few structures in the central zone that had remained standing, a fact which Joel's structural instincts attributed to its having been built 8 years before the cost-cutting philosophy had fully taken hold, and which its current occupants were presumably not thinking about in those terms. The princess arrived with 2 members of the royal household staff, and the particular forward momentum of a 9-year-old who has been told this is a formal meeting, and has processed this information, and decided to store it somewhere temporarily, while she got to the part she actually wanted. She said before the formal greeting was complete that she had looked up the 3rd support point. Joel said that he was glad to hear it. She said that the engineering database her tutor had accessed described the relevant load distribution principle in 4 paragraphs, and that none of the 4 paragraphs had explained it as well as he had while crawling through rubble in the dark, and that she wanted to know if this was a skill that could be taught, or if it required the rubble specifically. Joel said that, in his experience, the rubble helped with focus but was not strictly necessary, and that he could explain most structural concepts with a flat surface and something to draw with, and that he was prepared to demonstrate this if she was interested, and that diagrams would be involved, and that she should not let the diagrams intimidate her, because he had once explained seismic load transfer to a geologist using a stack of nutrition wafers, and it had gone reasonably well despite the medium being technically edible. The princess looked at him with the layered eyes she had inherited from her mother, and said that she wanted to know about seismic load transfer. He spent 40 minutes with her, on the floor of the reception room with a stylus and the back of a logistics manifest that Bryn had given him when he'd asked if she had any paper, because Bryn always had what was needed and had long since stopped asking why. The princess asked questions that were precise and followed logically from each other, in a way that suggested she was building something in her mind as they went. A structure of understanding assembled beam by beam, each new concept placed with care on top of the last, tested for stability before the next one was added. Joel recognized this. It was how he thought about debris fields. It was, he suspected, how her mother thought about interstellar policy, and how the sovereign architecture of a four-world system stayed standing across generations, despite everything the universe periodically did to test its load tolerances. At the end of the 40 minutes, the princess said that when she was old enough, she wanted to see a real debris field assessment. Joel said that he hoped she would see a great many infrastructure inspections that prevented debris fields from being necessary in the first place, but that yes, if circumstances required it, he would show her how it was done. She said that she had told her mother he would say something like that. He looked up. The balcony above the reception room had the quality of space that is trying to appear unoccupied and is not quite succeeding, a stillness that had too much attention in it to be absence. He did not look directly at it. He looked at the princess instead, who was examining the diagram on the logistics manifest with the focused expression of someone committing it to a memory she intended to keep. He thought about 11 years of debris fields across 14 colony systems, and about the particular arithmetic of how many of them had been avoidable, and about what 12 years of infrastructure deficit looked like when the resonance fault finally made its opinions known. He thought about the acoustic signal that turned out to be a water pipe, and the one before it that had not. He thought about the confidence interval of 89%, which Dow had called quite good actually, and about the 7 remaining percent and what it cost, and what it meant to work in the space between the numbers where the actual people were. He thought that he was going to need a significantly larger equipment budget than the initial allocation, and that he was going to have this conversation with someone who had 3 days of not sleeping behind her eyes, and the composure of a sovereign and something else besides. Something that had shown itself briefly in a converted relief tent among folding chairs, and then retreated behind its own architecture, waiting with the patience of a load-bearing thing that has learned to hold its weight quietly. He thought that this was a conversation he was prepared to have. The princess asked if he was going to stare at the ceiling for much longer, or if they were going to get to the part about lateral force resistance. Joel said they were absolutely getting to the part about lateral force resistance, and retrieved the stylus and drew the next diagram, and the structure between them continued, beam by careful beam, to hold.